Hey guys, so I have been traveling a lot lately. I'm now finally back at home in Toronto. I was in Calgary, Vancouver, Nanaimo, Vancouver again. I thought I would do this video and tell you what I've been doing traveling around Western Canada, what I've been talking to Canadians about, what I've been saying. So what I've been talking about is Canadian freedom, one of my favorite subjects, and this idea that you need to define it, defend it, and use it or you will lose it. And if we don't defend our freedom, if we don't use it, we will lose it because it is under constant threat. And threats to the fundamental constitutional freedoms of Canadians, they come from all levels of government. I know a lot of us on this channel are always focused on the things that the federal government is doing, but they're not the only problem. It's the federal government, the provincial governments, the municipal governments. It's just the nature of all government and all politicians to be power seeking. And we also are seeing new emerging threats undermining freedom in academia and from professional regulators. So let's go through this one by one. The federal government, we know what they've been up to. They've proposed and implemented some especially concerning laws. You know, there was the Online Streaming Act passed in 2023 that undermines freedom of speech by putting its thumb on the scale of the algorithm of what you see on streaming platforms like YouTube right here, but also on Netflix and Spotify, and it gives the CRTC the power to rig the algorithm. You know, it might not be censorship in the traditional sense, but I've talked about it sort of this way. If the government says what books need to go in a bookstore in the front window and what need to go on a dark shelf at the back of the store, we would probably call that censorship. And that's essentially what the government rigging the algorithm online actually is doing. It's rigging the system in a way to benefit existing media that has a symbiotic relationship with government. And when government controls the media, the press ceases to be free. And these laws, the Online Streaming Act and the regulations, that they're a way of controlling media. When I was in Nanaimo speaking at Vancouver Island University, the students I was speaking to had been reading Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, and I was rereading it. And Tocqueville wrote about freedom of the press, and he wrote about it at a time when there was a proliferation of newspapers that made it difficult to sway national mass opinion. And I think we're sort of seeing something like that today. The large national legacy outlets still exist, but their ownership is being disrupted. Some of them are losing majoritarian grip, especially with younger generation. And with the explosion of new outlets of information like YouTube, podcasts, Substacks, and independent media outlets, you know, there's just a proliferation of new sources. And Tocqueville observed that the more centralized a government is, the smaller the number of newspapers or media. And with that comes less freedom. So centralizing media and killing off competition from new emerging technologies and entrepreneurs, like through the Online Streaming Act, that's in fact a way of preserving state power. And so are direct subsidies. So let me talk about that now. This is a part of another piece of federal legislation called the Online News Act. Now, instead of responding to that proliferation and competition of media, something that Tocqueville actually embraced, Canada's government responded in typical government fashion. First, there were media bailouts, and then there was a funding scheme. And the Trudeau government's plan was to divert revenue from those successful new businesses to the flailing media. And the act really spectacularly backfired. Meta announced that they would not participate in the new funding scheme, which caused news content, of course, to disappear from Canadian users' Facebook and Instagram feeds. We've all seen that. Now, eventually, Google did agree to pay. They paid about $100 million. But as a result of the Trudeau policy, the news industry has been further undermined, and Canadians actually lost access to an important platform for news. And this subsidy and funding scheme has actually hurt the free press in another way. You know, I hear regularly from members of the public that they believe that the legacy media is now bought and paid for by the government through these subsidies. And I'm not sure if I agree that the media is directly changing their reporting because of the government subsidies. You know, my observation is that the bigger threat is actually this perception among the public that they might change their reporting. And a perceived conflict can actually be as damaging as a real conflict. And in the long term, these subsidies undermine press credibility and, in turn, freedom of the press. But that doesn't end the Trudeau government's assault on freedom in the digital world. I think perhaps most disturbing was the proposed piece of legislation, Bill C-63, the Online Harms Act. Now, I know the Online Harms Act is technically dead now, but whoever replaces Justin Trudeau, most likely Mark Carney, I think that there's a really strong possibility that that leader will attempt to bring it back. And the Online Harms Act is traditional censorship. In fact, the criminal prohibitions in the Online Harms Act went even further than traditional censorship by censoring future speech. The law would have allowed individual Canadians to ask for peace bonds against someone who might commit a hate crime in the future, which would allow judges to order things like demands for samples of bodily fluids, order house arrest, or even ankle monitors, all for things that have not actually happened yet. It's punishment for future crimes. And of course, for me, one of the biggest black marks against Trudeau is always going to be his use of the Emergencies Act against protesters who were upset with the government over vaccine mandates and lockdowns. And of course, the important part of that story isn't just that Trudeau used that extraordinary law, but that the federal court sided with us in our legal challenge against his use of that law and found that he used it illegally. You know, the appeal in that case, I've talked about it in a number of other videos. It was just heard by the Federal Court of Appeal at the beginning of February, and we are fighting tooth and nail to preserve the precedent. Now, another part of Trudeau's constitutional legacy, of course, is his hostility to the provinces and his desire to insert the federal government into provincial jurisdiction, contrary to the constitutional division of powers. The division of powers acts as a really important constitutional constraint on government overreach, and the federal government has illegally inserted themselves into the provincial domain. And there are a number of examples of that, like the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act, the carbon tax law. I think the Supreme Court got it wrong there, but they got it right when they found that the Impact Assessment Act was an illegal intrusion into provincial jurisdiction. That's the No More Pipeline law. And there's also the Trudeau government's attempt to classify all plastic products as toxic, something that I also think is contrary to the constitutional division of powers, but we're going to wait for a decision from the Federal Court of Appeal on that one. Now, speaking of provinces, I do want to talk about some of the concerning trends we have seen at the provincial level recently. Quebec has hurt religious children by banning all prayer in schools, a total prohibition on religion that could easily be accommodated, quite literally by doing nothing and just letting children, go about their day and pray if they need to. The Quebec Minister of Education said something especially disturbing in relation to that regulation or directive that bans prayer in school. He said it doesn't prohibit prayer because students may pray silently and discreetly. So good to know that silent thought is allowed by the Quebec government for now. We will see some places where governments are trying to ban that as well. I'll talk about that in a minute. So in the Quebec case, we are suing the government. We are intervening in a lawsuit against the government over that. There's also a case in Ontario where a group of teachers argued that a government mandated math test for teacher candidates was racist. I've talked about that case on this channel as well. We intervened and succeeded in having the lower court decision that the test was racist overturned. We're also intervening in a Supreme Court case originating out of the province of Newfoundland that's being heard this April. So the Newfoundland government is claiming that there is no constitutional protection of the right to what we call mobility simpliciter. That's the right to travel between provinces. And we at the CCF say that this is protected under Section 6 of the Charter. And it's obvious from the entire scheme of the Constitution that there was an intention by our founders to create a single country federally united into one dominion. Now, the last thing I will say about provinces is about healthcare. Healthcare access in Canada is a real problem, and wait times have gotten even worse since the pandemic. We know that people suffer and die on government-controlled medical wait lists and that their conditions deteriorate. Yet provinces across Canada have prohibitions on things that would allow patients to go outside the government monopoly healthcare system when that system fails. There are provincial prohibitions on doctors from working in both government and private clinics, which makes those clinics not viable. There are prohibitions on private health insurance for government covered services, which also undermines the viability of these clinics. And the failure of the government monopoly system puts patient health and lives at risk everywhere other than Quebec. That's because in Quebec, you can use private clinics because of a Supreme Court case called Shayouli that struck down those prohibitions I just described. In Shayouli, the Supreme Court held that access to a wait list is not access to healthcare. But in Shayouli, the case was decided under the Quebec Charter rather than under identical provisions of the Canadian Charter. And as a result, people outside of Quebec have fewer rights to choose how to access healthcare. Now, there was an important case in British Columbia that challenged this. It's a case we were involved in called Cambie, and the facts in Cambie were almost identical to the facts in Shayouli. But really bizarrely, the British Columbia Court of Appeal reached a different conclusion in Cambie, finding that the violations of patients' right to life and safety were consistent with the principles of fundamental justice or justified under Section 1 of the Charter to preserve this government monopoly system. Now, I think it's bizarre to me that a policy that the court finds is killing people could either be fundamentally just or justified in a free and democratic society. I mean, this is really sacrificing people to an ideology, sacrificing their lives to a government ideology. Now, the Supreme Court should have resolved the inconsistencies between Cambie and Shayouli, but in what I think is a cowardly move, the Supreme Court dodged the case by declining leave to appeal. Now, I've talked about the federal government, the provincial governments. I don't want to let municipal governments off the hook because it is in fact often our petty local tyrants that present the greatest risks to our freedom. You all know that about my Calgary case where we challenged the bubble zone bylaw that has the government picking and choosing the topics who are allowed to protest near libraries or rec centers. I've talked about that case a lot. There are a lot of videos that you can go and check out where I explain that case in detail. But what I'll say about bubble zone laws is once the government is deciding what you can protest and what you cannot, the right to freedom of expression and its role in democracy ceases to have any meaning whatsoever. But there are actually laws just like this all over Canada. There's a Waterloo bylaw that bans bullying, whatever that means, on public property. There's a Whitehorse law that bans microaggressions, which they define as a comment or action that subtly or often unconsciously or unintentionally expresses a prejudiced attitude. See, I told you the government was going to come after thoughts at some point. There are, of course, a multiplicity of cities and towns that have tried or have banned political signs, something that I say entrenches incumbent advantage because, the city councillor who's enacting these sign bans is preserving their advantage of name recognition by preventing their competition from advertising. So I think it's a really cynical thing to do. We also see that there are threats to freedom in Canada coming from outside direct government control. This is in academia and in regulated professions. Now, this is what I was in Vancouver talking about. I was at Simon Fraser University talking about academic freedom. I'll leave aside the encampment issues, although I've talked about that on this channel a lot. And I think that the inability or unwillingness of universities to remove radical trespassers from their campus who intimidate Jewish students and destroy university property, I think that's highly disturbing. But I'll speak more directly about academic freedom. We're monitoring a situation at one university where the university appears to be violating a requirement of the Universities Act that governs them in that province that requires them to be non-political in principle. And they've done this in a number of ways. For example, the university has made repeated statements that they are on unceded Indigenous land. They've imposed DEI fidelity statements for hiring or appointing faculty. So if you are applying for a faculty job or an appointment within the faculty, you need to express your agreement or loyalty to these diversity, equity, and inclusion doctrines. And then the Board of Governors at this university has publicized statements condemning violence in Israel or Palestine and issued opinions on the morality or lawfulness or justification of the war in Israel. So I think that if you are working in academia in that university and you have a different perspective that disagrees with the university's perspective, your speech is almost certainly going to be chilled. Even though universities are intended to be places of debate, discovery, and truth-seeking. And academic freedom is a critically important value in a free and democratic society. It is, in fact, the essence of the university. There's a Supreme Court case called Grant and Torstar. It doesn't deal with universities, but it speaks to the importance of the free exchange of ideas as an essential precondition for the search of truth. And academic freedom is so closely linked to freedom of expression. I can't say too much about this situation. I'll just say that we're monitoring it. We're really concerned, and we're continuing to observe what happens with academic freedom across Canada. Now, the last thing I'll say about current threats to our freedom relates to professional regulators. Many of us are in regulated professions. I am in one as a member of the Law Society. Doctors, nurses, accountants, engineers, and countless other Canadians are in regulated professions. And look, professional regulators, they have an important role. They exist to stop things like sexually harassing a client or a patient, or a lawyer stealing from a trust account, or a doctor giving incompetent advice, or leveraging his professional credentials to run a scam. Those are all valid purposes of a regulator, but we're increasingly seeing professionals in these roles being punished by their regulator for their off-duty, non-professional speech about just social, religious, cultural, political issues. And I think everyone's familiar with the case of Jordan Peterson. We intervened in that case, but there are countless other cases like his involving much more innocuous speech and people who just can't afford to fight back like Dr. Peterson did. We were involved in a case involving a nurse in Saskatchewan named Carolyn Strom, who was disciplined for posting on Facebook about the need for improvements to the healthcare system. And she was disciplined by her regulator. There were disciplinary attempts made against another nurse in Saskatchewan who attended an anti-abortion protest. There have been complaints against an Ontario doctor who advocated for gun control, and against another Ontario doctor for a letter she wrote to her church about her theological views on pandemic changes to communion. And there was discipline leveled against two Ontario doctors who wrote what I describe as intemperate emails to the head of the Ontario Medical Association for what they considered a bad deal on doctors' fees with government. And I don't think that anyone would think some cardiologist is less competent and able to engage in the practice of cardiology because he wrote an angry email to the head of his bargaining unit about the government deal on fees. And punishing people like that is censorship, because the regulator can take away the livelihood of the members of the profession just because they've said something unpopular. And this is leading to a chill in speech. Members of these professions are already self-censoring. This is a really urgent situation. There's about to be a change in federal leadership. Which direction the new Liberal leader, whoever it is, probably Mark Carney, is going to take our country. I think we all expect that there's going to be an election. The federal polls for the Conservatives are pretty uncertain, and the values that Carney stands for are really, frankly, a question mark for Canadians. And even if there is an election, the outcome is uncertain. And in any event, we just cannot expect politicians to save us. They are self-interested, and commitments made in opposition to principles like freedom, they often fall away to political expediency once those politicians are in power. And at the same time, I think we're right now observing what many people are referring to as this vibe shift. This is a subtle but palpable change in our current cultural, social, and political mood. It's not a concrete policy shift. It's more of an intuitive sense that the collective energy, priorities, or assumptions of society are just pivoting right now. You can maybe think of it as a zeitgeist recalibration. The old ways of feeling or framing things, they just stop resonating, and something new is starting to bubble up. And in Canadian politics, we've historically been dominated by a centrist tug and war between the Liberals and the Conservatives, with maybe the NDP or other parties nibbling at the edges. But a vibe shift, I think, could signal a break from that predictable rhythm. It's less about a single election result and more about how Canadians feel about their system, leaders, or even our national identity. I think right now, the Liberals feel stale, but the vibe shift just isn't about policy fatigue or one political party. It's emotional. And, that sense of the sunny, Canada is back vibe of Trudeau from 2015, it's really curdled into something grumpier and more pragmatic. And this just isn't about the possibility of a liberal to conservative swing. A vibe shift can mean deeper unease and dissatisfaction with the federal daddy knows best attitudes of federalism and of government diktats and of the scolding tone of political correctness, whoever it is coming from. And I think right now it's an urgent situation because this is an opportunity to capitalize on that unease and shape our culture for a new decade to be better oriented towards freedom. We cannot leave this in the hands of politicians, but what we can do as civil society is try to orient them towards freedom out of their own self-interest. So what would this look like? Reorienting Canada's legal culture towards freedom would create a better and freer country. We didn't always live in a culture that felt so stifling and oppressive. We had a solid national identity and a history we were proud of, rooted in the ideas of great thinkers of the past. And these foundations of our society are strong and good. Think of the principles that ground us: individual liberty, freedom of expression, democracy. These all date back centuries to the ancient Greeks, to the Magna Carta. Our foundation as a society is a strong one, and it's going to take a lot more than a few years of bad government to undermine it. And I also want to emphasize that the text of our Constitution is clear. We have civil rights and liberties. They are protected by the highest law in our country, and you cannot get around the text that is clear in black and white. Now, of course, there are obstacles. There are activists who seek to abuse citizens and undermine our rights by advocating for the policies I described at the beginning of this video. And they believe, because every single villain in history believes this, that they are in fact the good guys, that they know best, that censorship is in everyone's interest when they decide what gets censored. When they take property for a purpose they think is noble, it's just. That intruding into another's jurisdiction is acceptable because they would do a better job. And of course, there are politicians willing to do their bidding, beholden to a small and noisy group of activists, and there are lawyers who will take the money to fight to undermine our freedom. And yes, there are activist judges who will side with the government as they move to take away our rights. But the good news is that we at the Canadian Constitution Foundation, we're just better at it than they are. We have better lawyers. Courts are siding with us in case after case. The municipalities that I talked about, many of them have rescinded their sign bans when we threatened them with litigation. Brampton, Niagara, Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, they all did that. Before C-63, the Online Harms Act, was killed off. It was actually split in two, with the federal Liberals abandoning some of their most controversial proposals after protracted advocacy by us at the Canadian Constitution Foundation and from other civil liberties groups. I appeared at a parliamentary committee about freedom of expression and C-63, and so did our executive director, Joanna Barron. We also recently had a small victory in a COVID-era case here in British Columbia, where we had challenged the vaccine passport for failing to create a workable system for medical exemptions. The court, while deciding not to issue a declaration, they did say that the equality rights of the teenage girl we worked with, Erica, her rights were, they said, very likely violated because she couldn't apply for a blanket exemption, even though she was ineligible for a second dose of a COVID vaccine because the first dose had given her pericarditis. We were successful in having a provision of the Canada Elections Act struck down for creating massive penalties for posting misinformation about politicians, even if you didn't know that the misinformation was not true. We intervened in that Impact Assessment Act challenge, the No More Pipelines law, because it intruded into provincial jurisdiction, and the Supreme Court agreed with us. They found that Parliament had, to quote the court, plainly overstepped its constitutional competence in enacting the scheme. And that case really marks the first significant development in constitutional law regarding federal authority over environmental assessments in the last 30 years. And it sends a clear signal that federal involvement in energy projects needs to be firmly rooted in constitutional jurisdiction. We had made really crucial submissions as an intervener in that case, arguing that the unconstitutional aspects of that legislation could be severed, which is what I believe actually allowed the court to reach the conclusion that it did. Now, on healthcare, of course, we were disappointed with the outcome of the challenge to the government monopoly system in the Canby case. That was one that we had supported for years with Dr. Brian Day. That litigation lasted over a decade, but the silver lining, I suppose, of the Supreme Court declining leave in Canby is that they actually didn't disrupt or destroy the precedent that was set by Shauli, which is a good case. And Shauli is still the governing law. And we at the CCF were actively working on finding a new case in a different jurisdiction to bring as a challenge. And we're looking for a friendlier jurisdiction than British Columbia, which is where that case was originally brought. There's an extremely promising opportunity to expand healthcare choice outside of Quebec using a really strong existing Supreme Court precedent so that all Canadians have the same rights. And of course, we brought the successful once-in-a-generation legal challenge to the Trudeau government's use of the Emergencies Act. The federal court sided with us, finding that Trudeau's use of that law was illegal and unconstitutional, and we are fighting to preserve that precedent. Now, on professional regulation, I wrote a really massive report about some of the most concerning cases of overreach and policing of off-duty speech by regulators. And that report resulted in so much media attention that now the government of Alberta has actually taken up a number of the recommendations from my report. The thing is, government is always going to try to introduce bad laws. They will always try to take action that undermines our rights. But we at the CCF, we fight back, and we actually have a track record of winning. I am deeply optimistic about our work strengthening civil society and reorienting it towards the values of freedom. Because the solution doesn't just come from litigating in the courts themselves, but also in litigating in the courts of public opinion. So we offer these free online courses at the ccf.ca/learn, where hundreds of people have already taken our courses in Constitutional Law 101 and freedom of expression. We write opinion pieces everywhere, yes, even in the Toronto Star. We write books that hit the bestseller lists. One of our books, Pandemic Panic, was on the bestseller list for Amazon, the Toronto Star, and the Globe and Mail, and was nominated for the most prestigious prize in Canadian public policy writing. And our second book, a really short primer on free expression that just came out, was an instant Amazon bestseller. We also have another book coming out for children. We want to build Canada's constitutional culture for the next generation. And I cannot tell you how many people are excited about the kids book that we are about to release and how many parents have asked us for resources like that. I visit the United States all the time, and I see these museum gift shops in the US that are chock full of books about the US, the American Constitution. And we here in Canada, we have a history we need to teach our children to be proud of. I have this YouTube channel that I can't believe is almost at 100,000 subscribers. That's just so wonderful and heartening and comforting to me about the number of people who actually care about our Constitution. Our podcast, Not Reserving Judgment, gets about 1,000 downloads an episode. People are really thirsty for this. I just spoke at Vancouver Island University, which I think is one of the most progressive university campuses in the country, and I talked to a packed lecture hall about our work. The students were excited to hear a different perspective, and they wanted to learn. We have a plan at the CCF to shift Canada's legal culture towards liberty. It is slow, hard work, but it is succeeding. So if you want to join this mission, sign up for our email freedom updates at the ccf.ca/freedom updates, or consider making a tax-deductible charitable donation. Thanks so much for watching, and let's keep fighting for freedom in Canada.